to accompany this, and just gonna hope that's working, and I'm going to assume if I don't get a thumbs down from Les, I'm going to assume it's working. Yeah, so yeah, thanks for asking me, Tolpuddle, Les, and the Radical History School. It was lovely to be there in person last year, and I'm hoping it's going to be possible next year. I'm looking forward to that. But this is second best, but at least we get to speak to people as far away as New Forest and New Mexico, even. So here we go. So in the summer of 1848, Britain came close to revolution, or at least that's what the government was fearing. The Chartists announced a monster gathering for April the 10th on Kennington Common to mark the collecting of a 5 million signature petition. And I'm going to show you, hopefully, how archival research has enabled me to get into the mindset of the government that year and use this famous photograph to show that while numerically the crowd posed little threat, the power of their argument was perceived as a threat to elite power. And by looking at a few documents, I hope to show just how worried the government were that year about the power the Chartists posed, and in turn how the Chartists came very close to achieving real political change. But first, let's remind ourselves quickly what Chartism was about. So the early 19th century, before the Chartists got started, had seen lots of campaigns by reformers to reform the electoral system, including some notorious events like Peterloo that you'll mostly be aware of. The government were finally persuaded to try and enact some form of electoral reform in the shape of the 1832 Reform Act, but this left the majority of working people still disenfranchised. So in 1838, the Chartists started their campaign for an annual secret ballot of every man over 21 to elect paid MPs, and adopted a policy of non-violence to do this. And you can see their slogan on the bottom right here: peaceably if we may, forcibly if we must. But after 10 years of campaigning and petitions, the Chartists were no closer to achieving their goal. But in 1848, this all changed. It suddenly became much more urgent, and plans were made for a final push with a monster petition to be presented to Parliament. 1848 was the year of revolutions across Europe. By April, there had already been risings in the German and Italian states, and in February, the French monarchy had been overthrown in favour of the Second Republic. Before the year was out, there were revolutions in countries we now know as Belgium, Poland, Romania, Hungary, and the Ukraine. But in Britain, the Chartist leadership were unprepared. Meetings were organised around the country, including one in the newly constructed Trafalgar Square on March the 6th, which was nearly called off when mass meetings were banned within a mile of the Houses of Parliament. But leader George Reynolds went ahead anyway, although later that night there was disorder and looting, which the newspapers blamed on the Chartists, although, as with a lot of events, these were kind of renegade gangs, had little to do with the actual event. And as David Goodway has shown, if you look at the table on the right, when they'd done an analysis of the arrests, a lot of them were youths. It could have been youthful exuberance. And crowds those days were a magnet for pickpockets. I'll come to that later. So to circumvent this government order, Reynolds moved the next meeting south of the river to Kennington Common, and this was to be held on March the 13th. This led to yet more rioting, again separate from the event, in Camberwell this time. But the decision to relocate south of the river would have far-reaching consequences. And the item at the bottom was one of the court cases against 30 people arrested in Camberwell. So the big meeting was going to be on April the 10th, and here's a poster for the event. And the main point of it was, as I say, to launch the petition and then march it from Kennington to Westminster and present it to Parliament. But note the additional demands here. As well as electoral form, they're looking for a fair day's wages for a fair day's work and demanding freedom from political serfdom. And most importantly, at the top, again, we have peace and order is our motto. But this obviously fell on deaf ears as the government expected violence, and we'll see why in a minute. Just before I move on, it's worth looking at the bottom. You can see there are 4 separate muster points: Stepney, Clerkenwell, Russell Square and Peckham Fields. And these were all going to converge on Kennington from all points of the compass. So if the Chartists were caught off guard, the government were too, but quickly caught up and were very soon on high alert. And this is an interesting part of working in the archives, because as you can see, when I found this poster, it was in 8 pieces. In order to photograph it, I had to piece it together. But it's a poster by the government banning the April the 10th meeting. But as well as banning it, they put in contingency plans to contain it should it go ahead. And the scale of the preparations show that they were preparing an attempt at a violent rising. They hadn't paid any attention to the Chartists' intent of non-violence. So again, back to the archives, I wanted to find out more, and I went to have a look in the Home Office papers in the National Archives. And it's great doing online research, and during this lockdown, it's great for researchers like myself, because you can carry on doing your online research. But what I want to show you is something I discovered that I probably wouldn't have done if I hadn't been there in person, so I'm looking forward to getting back there. On a visit to Kew, I stumbled upon this intriguing record, and you can see how it came up in the search at the bottom. Chartist riots, 1848. Well, I was puzzled by this because the image that I'd seen of Kennington, which you can see at the top here, appeared to be one of a restrained and orderly meeting, certainly not what we would call a riot. Inside were details of the numbers of troops and police to be stationed in strategic locations on April the 10th. And the first document was this one, concerning biscuits, spirits and salt pork. And in case you're getting hungry here, I should stress we're not talking about chocolate hobnobs. These were twice baked hardtack biscuits, a form of bread substitute. And the spirits were a kind of low-grade rum to make the water palatable. Lord Fitzroy Somerset, acting on orders from Wellington, made this memorandum of the list of all the requisitioning for provisioning these troops all over London. And it goes on and on. I'm not going to read them all, don't worry. But halfway down this central column, we've got the Admiralty Horse Guards, 10 days supply of salt pork, biscuits and spirits for 5,000 men, say 50,000 rations. And then on the other side, we've got the Bank of England, another 10 days supply, 2,000 rations. You can see it goes on all over London. Then we've got the Tower of London, 9,000 rations, being 15 days supply for 600 men. But these rations, you can see in the centre, ready to be moved at short notice to other strategic locations. So 15 days. These documents indicate a serious military planning for a mobilisation. I've added it up, 8,000 troops for 10 to 15 days. And what this amounted to is the largest lockdown the capital has ever seen, probably to this day. They were clearly expecting serious insurrection. And what is fascinating is the last minute nature of the planning. A frenzy of correspondence between the Prime Minister, Wellington and Somerset all over the weekend before. You can see this one here was dated the 8th of April. The next one was dated the 9th of April. And this one orders lists the squadrons of foot soldiers and cavalry and all the places they're going to go. And top right, you can see they've even got 12 batteries of heavy artillery. And this was for a load of peaceful campaigners. In addition to the troops, 4,000 police were taken off general duties. to blockade the bridges and to go to a few other places as well. And the strategy was going to be to allow the processions to cross the river in the morning to get south to Kennington, but prevent them coming back. And what you could probably call this is the first example of kettling, and probably the largest example of kettling, because effectively they kettled the whole of the south of London. And I won't list all of these, but the highlighted ones are interesting. These are the bridges. 200 police on Vauxhall Bridge, 500 on Westminster Bridge. Further down, 500 Waterloo Bridge. Blackfriars, you can see we've got 400. 40 of those were going to be mounted. And at the bottom, we've got 7 riverboats of police patrolling the river to make sure no crafty Chartists decided to use a boat to get back north. And in addition to this, I've read, not in the archives, but there's a lot of history books about this, that allegedly 70,000 special constables were also sworn in. And I found this hard to believe. I'm always a bit suspicious of figures till you can verify them. But so I started looking at the sign-ups for specials, and there were so many that I had to make a video of them. And here's the video. There was just not enough room on my camera storage to scan everything in. And you can see that for each special constable signed up, you've got their name, you've got their address. Most were conscripted by their employers to guard their places of work. Some refused to sign up and lost their jobs. I've seen documents of people trying to get their jobs back later on. Most were workers and craftsmen, but some were middle-class volunteers, and allegedly Charles Dickens was one of them. Now, I haven't spotted his name on this list. I need to go back to the archives to see if that's just an urban myth or not. And it just goes on and on. Now you can see the total on the bottom of this list is 22,600. So we know there are at least that many. The next one, more videos. There's a total on the bottom that's hurriedly put together of about 27,000. So I can confidently say that there were 20 to 30,000 specials signed up, and who knows, maybe there were 70,000. And they went armed and prepared. On the left here, we have a receipt for the manufacture of truncheons for the special constables. And we've got a total of 5,190 truncheons at a cost of £259, 10 shillings. And it's interesting that, I'll see if I can make my point of, we've got 1,000 for the district of Marylebone. They're all by region. So these specials weren't going to Kennington. They weren't going to the bridges. They were to stay in their own location to guard them when the Chartists ran riot across the capital, as they expected. And you can see here that that some even kept their truncheons as souvenirs. On the day, they would have just been plain wood, but these come up at auction still, quite collectible, quite creatively decorated in some cases. So what happened? In the morning of the day, the 4 processions that I've mentioned converged on Kennington Common, including the leaders carrying their petition on a horse-drawn van. And on the left of the top image, we can see the van with the petition. It's a big round bale of paper. And once on the common, the Chartist leader, Fergus O'Connor, was summoned to a meeting with the police, who told him in no uncertain terms that the procession would not be allowed to accompany the petition north to Parliament. And he had the unenviable task of breaking this news to the crowd. This didn't go down well, as you can imagine. There was a big disagreement among the committee, including the Black Chartist leader, William Cuffey, who thought they should defy this order and confront the police. But then it started raining heavily and the meeting broke up. Now, I've oversimplified this. If you want to find out, there's lots and lots of history books about this. very interesting. But a small contingent were allowed to take the petition to Westminster in the afternoon, but only a few accompanying a horse-drawn taxi, probably 4 or 5 people.
Just before we move on, there's a question come in about this meeting, and the question is, and I'll take it now if that's all right with you. I've long assumed that at Chartist mass meetings it was impossible to hear the speakers unless you were near the platform. Do we have any sense of what the sound was like?
Well, glad you've asked that. Actually, I have got some sound at the end of this. At the end of this talk, that is actually an actor. It's going to be, but yeah, it's a really good question. At some meetings that I've looked at earlier in that century with Henry Hunt speaking, he starts the meetings by saying to them, and I remember one at Spa Fields, he hangs out of a window of a pub and he says, if you lot are going to have any chance to, I'm paraphrasing here, if you lot are going to have any chance of hearing me at all, I want silence. And by silence, I mean absolute silence. I don't mean saying shush to each other. You've got to stay silent. So it's a really good question. One assumes that there was a form of Chinese whispers, but the other thing is you can see there were at least 2 stages, possibly 3 here. So yeah, good question, and I'm afraid I can't give you a categoric answer. So I'll move on. Press reports variously claimed the attendance to have been anything from 20,000, that's the Times of the next day, to 150,000 in the Chartist owned newspaper, the Northern Star. And this compares with 200,000 that had been hoped for and obviously anticipated by the government. The following weekend's London Illustrated News ran a 6-page feature where I've got these images from, and the bottom one is taken from the daguerreotype, and it even says so. And the bottom one is just sort of imagined view of the procession in the morning as it approached the Common, and it shows the social mix quite nicely. And also they showed this one of the Bank of England being guarded by troops, and you can see the troops here all lined up in pairs all the way around the railings, and one assumes that goes right the way around. So that, you know, the government weren't messing around. They thought there was going to be a violent rising. It turned out a few days later the petition was rejected by Parliament, who challenged the total claimed of 5 million signatures, discounting some as duplicate or fake. I ended up agreeing on 2 million, which is absolutely stunning petition. It's twice as many as who petitioned Parliament for President Bush not to be allowed to come on a state visit the other year. So it's a serious amount, 2 million, but it was discounted. Anyway, O'Connor's capitulation caused a schism in the movement, with some reluctantly discarding their previous strategy of peaceably if we may, to a new pragmatic forcibly if we must. And some began to prepare for all-out revolution now. But government spies infiltrated the meetings, and many Chartists, including William Cuffey, who we can see here and who we heard a lot about at last year's Radical History School. Cuffey was arrested and later in that summer was transported to Australia. This image was drawn of him awaiting transportation. But a couple of weeks ago, we had a bit of good news. We just heard that Cuffey is about to have this social housing project in Walworth named after him. And it really is especially pertinent right now in relation to the Black Lives Matter movement. So let's see if we can tell how many were there. I recently had the privilege of viewing the originals of these 2 familiar images, and they're now archived in the Royal Collection in the Round Tower of Windsor Castle. And I had to apply for a special permit, and the archivist had to stand with me, and I wasn't even allowed to touch them. But they're beautiful objects. They're 4 by 3 inches each. There's 2 of them, and each of them is transcribed on the back. And this surprised me, by Queen Victoria herself, because the archivist knew her handwriting. Great Chartist meeting at Kennington Common, taken from nature, an interesting turn of phrase because obviously photography was relatively new at the time. And with them are 2 prints pasted on the back of a printed souvenir from the Home Secretary. And these are inscribed by Albert himself. So what we have here is a close personal interest taken in the event by the royal family, possibly because they'd been packed off to the Isle of Wight for their own safety. And some politicians even thought the Solent wasn't going to be wide enough to protect them from the Chartists, who were presumably going to cross the Solent with guns. There's some debate about whether these photographs were commissioned by Albert as a memento, by the government as a form of surveillance, or by the London Illustrated News. Personally, I think it's possibly all 3, but we'll come back to that in a minute. But whatever the provenance, they presented a unique opportunity to researchers like myself. And I wanted to see if I could determine how many people were in this image. I mean, I should say that we think this is the first image of a political crowd that was ever taken photographically. And certainly, quite likely, one of the first images of any kind of crowd. In my day job, I work with image manipulation, so it was relatively easy for me to combine both daguerreotypes together, and that's what we see here. I've photoshopped them together in the middle into a panorama, so we can now see 2 of the stages in here, and one of them, you can see the lettering. I've transposed them so we can now read it correctly, because daguerreotypes are actually glass slides. They don't read correctly. Critically, the urban street horizon in the background enabled me to match this to a map of the time. And so I could tell that in the far distance, we're looking at the whole length of the common. Previously, I thought we were just seeing a small section of it. The key is this chimney in the horizon. And here you see this oil of vitriol manufactory on the east of the common. And it was actually notorious in the time for causing horrible smells in Kennington. It made sulfuric acid, and I found a reference to sulfuric and muriatic fumes. I mean, it would never be allowed anywhere near the centre of London these days, but it means that we can locate, and you can see the buildings along that length of the park, and they really do pretty much match to what we've got here. And so I wanted to see where the camera was. So you can see I've plotted it back, and there's a couple of buildings on that corner. And I think it was probably in this one on the right, the Horns Tavern. It could have also been in Watkins Coffee Emporium on the left. But the daguerreotype process was a messy, wet chemical process. So Kilburn, the photographer, probably hired an upstairs room, and it would have been easy to hire it in a pub, and it would have served as a dark room to process his images straight away, but also to provide this elevated view of the event. Before I move on to the next one, note the wooden paled fencing, and that's quite useful because it helps to see what we've got in the image. So bearing that in mind, if you look down at the bottom here, you can see the road surface, and there's some horses and carts going along there, and you can see spectators, and they're holding back. They're standing this side of the fence, and then in front of them there's a bit of gap, some grass, and a relatively loose density of protesters, getting denser and denser as you get close to the 2 stages. If you look in the distance, you can see that that there are people still arriving. I think this is probably the Peckham contingent coming in. So they're still arriving. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here, and you can see there's a few other things that are useful for my purposes, because what's quite important with this image is what time it was taken to know if the meeting had reached its peak. It looks like it hadn't quite reached its peak, because the shadows, there was quite bright sun. Here we are. The shadows here from these chimneys are showing pretty high sun. It's about 2 weeks after the the spring equinox, and I think we've probably got an image taken about midday, 12:30, something like that. Next bit in the middle here, well, for a start, you can't see many women in the crowd. There are a few on the stages. And these two young boys in the middle, the one with the white coat, maybe I'm being cynical here. I'm wondering if there's some of these pickpockets. There's been talk of whistling and signalling between pickpockets, but hey, maybe I'm being unfair. Maybe like me, when I attended political events when I was that age, I know it changed my life. It changed my life politically, and maybe it did with these guys. I also like to speculate a bit about individuals, and there's two that fascinate me down the bottom here. This old lady in the plaid skirt and the hood, she seems to be completely oblivious to the momentous event that's happening just behind her. I mean, who knows? But I think she's just walking past this as if nothing else is going on. And then next to her is this bloke who seems to be looking at the camera, which is actually quite surprising, because if I flip back to the previous image, if it'll let me, there we go. Almost everyone apart from that guy is looking away from the camera, which leads me to think that the meeting has started in some form, because I don't know about you guys, but when you attend demos and you're waiting for speakers to start, you're kind of chatting to each other and turning around. All the attention is away from the camera. And then what I also had, which is really interesting from my point of view, is these real-time police memos. And they're literally like you'd imagine them texting back to headquarters. And they sent them back. They were scribbled on little bits of paper and sent back by message boys. So on the top left, we've got 9 a.m. This one's from Stepney Green. About 2,000 assembled on Stepney Green. No appearance of their being armed. The middle one's from Russell Square, 10 a.m. The procession is moving from Russell Square, about 10,000, principally mechanics. And of course, they mean labouring people by that. And then finally, we've got this report from the Common itself. Paul's Livery Stables was their headquarters for the police. The procession, 11:15, the procession is now filing onto the Common, not the slightest appearance of arms or bludgeons. They have formed 7 to 8 deep, and at the time of the procession arrived, there were then present on the Common around 5,000 persons, and the approach is crowded with spectators. So the crowd was small and peaceful, we could see that, but these were only estimates, and attendance was still, and is still, contentious. Some newspapers reported a crowd of just 30,000. So I decided to use the daguerreotype as evidence by overlaying a grid and counting the crowd square by square. And I think we might have time for you to take 30 seconds out here, or a minute, and I'd like you to see if you can see how many people are in this square on the bottom right, which I've blown out of that. And you can be generous. And I can't see the chat here, I don't think, but I'm going to get Les hopefully to have a look in the chat, and just if you could sample a few of the suggestions and maybe your own.
Yeah, I will do that. If people put their estimate into the chat, I'll be able to pass it on to you.
Yeah.
People are busy counting now.
Yeah. So we're looking for a rough head count here. We're not marking this.
Okay, I've got 120 from Australia, 120 from Pauline Fraser, 170 from Chris Wright, 25,000 in.
Well, I love it. There's always somebody that bucks the trend. Yeah.
Yeah. 150 from Sarah Passman and Michael Wallace, 125 from Tris Menser, 91 from Michael Butler, 110 from Susan Ellich, and 100 from Caroline Derry.
Fantastic.
And 150 from Danny Riley. Should we stop there?
Yeah, that's good. They're all coming. So we got, you know, 100, 150 seems to be quite popular, apart from the 25,000. I did do this talk once at Kennington itself, and I had a child in the audience who said 1 billion. Anyway, so for that square, people normally come up with around 100, 150, 200 max. Okay, I'm going to say 500, okay? Because I want to be absolutely sure that I'm being fair about this. But you'll see what happens in the next slide when I put all these in. Now you can see your square in the middle there where you've come up with about 150. I've got 500. Here are all the other squares. And it absolutely staggered me. When I first did this, I couldn't believe it. I thought I have to be doing something wrong. And I'm still looking for the error. But I've run this past a lot of people, and I just can't believe that when you add them up, there's less than 4,000 people in this picture. So I've obviously counted, recounted again. But if this is right, compared with the 8,000 troops, 4,000 police, and at least 20,000 special constables, this crowd was seriously outnumbered. So look, let's round it up again. Let's round it up to 5,000, and I'm hoping you can see my figures at the top. Sometimes it's covered up by the little zoom thing that comes up there. But anyway, I'll read it down. So the visible crowd in my photograph at midday, let's say 5,000. We know that this is taken a bit before the peak, so let's add another 2,000 for people that arrived later on, say up to 1 o'clock. Then let's add another 3,000 for people in the park that aren't in the photograph. We know the spectators observing from outside the railings, so let's add another 3,000 there, and 2,000 for people hanging out the windows around the common. What do we get? Still only 15,000. I don't know what's going on here, but I think even allowing room for error, I think your maximum for this event would have been 20 to 30,000. There's no way I can push this figure higher than that. And this is counterintuitive. This goes against pretty much every history book I've read about this. Well, should we be surprised about that? Probably not. Let me go to my next slide. Okay. Here we've got our image at the top that we know about. At the bottom, we have the 2012 Download Festival. It's the headline act, The Prodigy, and this was a ticketed event. And we can pretty safely say there's around 60,000 people in this image. And if, like me, you're regular festival goers, or you've been to any large event, sporting events, political demonstrations, you know that you know what 60,000 people feels like and looks like. And these days, in order to get a picture of 60,000 people, you have to get up high. You have to get up in a drone or helicopter. And if you compare it with Kilburn's image, where he's only got up maybe first or second floor of a pub, there's no surprise. This is a much smaller image. But the key really is in the density, and this is what crowd scientists use. This is what the police use, and this is what I use to try and work out what's going on here. And crowd scientists these days work on a safe density of around 2 people per square metre. This can rise to 4 people near stages, possibly even 5, but it tends to drop off to around 1 at the periphery. And surprise, surprise, when we look at the Kennington image, this is what we're getting. We're getting bunching around the stages at a sort of possibly uncomfortable and dangerous 4 to 5 people. And then at the edge, we're going down to 1, 1.5. But that means you've got an average of about 1.5, 2 people per square metre. Now, the theoretical capacity of the common, which I've worked out as 92,000 square metres, means that the capacity was maybe over 100,000. So there's still something going on here. Why do I only get 30,000? Where was everyone? Well, I've got a few ideas. Monday by then was a working day. The idea of the St. Monday day off after the weekend had pretty much pretty much gone. So many would have been at work. Others may have signed up as special constables, possibly against their will. Some could have been scared off. The press had been bigging this event up, and there was a lot of worry about it. Others may have been curious, but unwilling to enter the common, sorry. And we know that pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood artist John Millay and Holman Hunt fell into that category. They attended, but they didn't want to enter the common. They stayed outside the fencing for fear of being arrested or dubbed as Chartists. Others could have been prevented from attending by the police on the bridges. So we've got the kettling working in the way they want it to work, with keeping the ones that arrived before midday, not letting them back across the river. But if people wanted to come later on, who knows? Maybe they were stuck in the north of the river and couldn't get there. But I think the crucial point with this is that we can focus too much on who was there on the day. And I don't know about you guys, but there's been times when I've wanted to go to really important demonstrations and I couldn't go. I just, it was too far, something else prevented me. And I think we can say that for every attendee that attended that day, there could have been 10 others that would have loved to have got there and didn't. So maybe 300,000 people in the capital were behind the Chartists in terms of it wanting to attend. And who knows, in the country, how many. We know by the petitions there was a lot. There were other events on this day. And also, my research shows that the London papers were much more interested in London events, the London-centric nature of the press, if you like. There's some huge events further north, not necessarily on this day. So there's a lot more to this than just the numbers in this picture. Interesting though it is for me. So was the state justified in their repressive clampdown, or was this paranoia brought on by the revolutionary wave of political upheavals throughout Europe? Well, it depended on your point of view. The Chartists were massively outnumbered. The government may have justified their military deployment, citing evidence of rioting associated with recent Chartist meetings. But the Chartists probably saw this as simply an excuse for an excessive show of force by the authorities, a final push, if you like, to subjugate the Chartists once and for all. And as we've seen, 1848 marked a turning point and led some Chartists to question the policy of moral rather than physical force. Just before I conclude, I'd like to make the image that we've got here a little bit more interesting by brightening it up a bit, and let's add a bit of colour to it, see if we can make this thing come to life so we can relate to it a bit more. On first sight, my theory appears to downplay the significance of the Great Chartist meeting, but actually, it does completely the opposite. To all parties, including organisers, the press and the government, this event was viewed as seriously powerful. It was big news both in the build-up and afterwards, with regional newspapers reprinting stories from the local London press. So what I'm suggesting is that the perception of the power of the crowd was greater than the actual attendance would imply. So rather than representing a weakness, a relatively small number of Chartists were perceived to present a serious and imminent threat. Rather than focus on the numbers, we should be concentrating on this, what I like to call projection of power. And when you look at the government response to reform meetings, you find that the non-violence of the reformers was repeatedly met with disproportionate force. The soft power of the crowd was confronted with the hard power of the state. All the Chartists wanted on April the 10th was to politely and lawfully make their case for a greater participation in democracy, and they were met with truncheons and artillery. But although by the end of the year the Chartists were totally subjugated, the government should have realised that ultimately you can't suppress ideas. As we know, within 70 years, 5 of the 6 points of the Charter became enshrined in law. The only one we don't have now is annual parliaments, and quite frankly, with what's been going on over the last few years, perhaps that wouldn't be a bad thing if we did. The legacy of the Chartists can now be detected across a wide sweep of political views under the umbrella of the broad left. And I suggest that British socialism and trade unionism can trace their roots back to the reform and labour movements of the 19th century.
Thank you, Dave. Can you just question here, Dave?
Just got one more thing to finish off, because I started off asking a question: was this triumph or capitulation for the Chartists? And I'd just like to leave Fergus O'Connor to answer this in his own word, if I've got time.
You have, yeah. I've got a couple of questions for at the end.
Yeah, and basically, O'Connor made a speech to the Kennington crowd after he'd bowed to the inevitable and called off the march. And a couple of years ago, at the 170th anniversary, the Kennington Chartist project were lucky enough to have an actor called Tom Collins come and give this speech. And sadly, Tom's no longer with us, but they've recorded this and allowed me to use it. So thanks for that. I'd like you to listen to this now and see what you think. And it really does kind of get us into the feel that day. There are a few vehicles in the background. Sorry about that, but I think the barking dogs add a bit of atmosphere. So here you go.
Let me counsel you. Let me enjoin nay. I would go down on my knees to beseech you. Do not destroy the cause I have so struggled for all of my life. In yonder carriage, go with you the voices of 5,700,000 of your countrymen. They, I, and the whole world look to you for good and orderly and citizen-like conduct on this occasion. In my place in the House, I told the ministers that they need not be afraid of my counsels and that they need apprehend no folly on your part. Well, they have not, though they threatened us, interfered with this meeting on Kennington Common. This is one great and glorious step achieved. And as I have always told you, Chartism, when struck down by tyranny, rises only to march onwards with renewed strength.
Just want to finish with one flippant remark. If the troops weren't needed, who ate all the biscuits? Actually, more importantly, who drank all the rum? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave. Dave, can you end share screen? Can you just bring us out of that?
I'll do that. Yep.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions before you do. One is, maybe it's too late. One is, can we tell what's written on the flags on that picture of the crowd?
Yeah.
What's that?
I think the wording on the side of the thing is Labour is the source of all wealth. I think that was the. There's been various thoughts because some people are standing in front. The flags on the main image. I mean, anyone you can Google this image. Anyone will get this. The flags are marshalling flags. They're numbers, just to marshal different points. We think.
And that comes back to the second question, which is what does the S signify on one of the flags?
The F.
S for sugar.
Oh, I thought that was a number 2.
All right.
Not
So
sure.
it could be, I think it's a marshalling point, don't you?
Could
I
be
think
S,
it is.
could be S, could be Stepney. Could be Stepney.
Yeah,
that's good. Thank you. Thank you for that. You tell you what, whenever you do one of these, you always go away learning something. So yeah, I'll look at that again. Thank you.
There's some really great comments coming, Dave, from Rose Wallace. Great talk, Dave. It's important to consider the response of authority to popular protest. Thanks, Dave. Really interesting stuff from Hazel. Simon Copper, thank you, Dave, Les and the TUC. It's wonderful to see time and intellectual effort being made to consider history-changing events. I think this was a history-changing event. It's really important, as you say, to think about what was in the Charter. For example, secret ballots that didn't come into the 1870s. The size of constituencies, the fact that MPs should get a salary, all those things came in over a period of time. This was really a set of demands which we now accept as the norm, pretty much, apart from annual parliaments. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, this is really why I've done quite a bit of work on early modern protest and other sort of like the protest of the belly, if you like. and obviously now we're talking about the protest of the planet with Extinction Rebellion and everything. But what you have in the mid-19th century is the realization that you're only going to improve, you know, the lot of your ordinary working man and people not being hungry if you got the vote. And so this is why this period is so fascinating, because we can date back everything we've got in terms of democratic rights to this point, and that's why it's so worrying to see some of them at risk now. Let's hope I'm wrong about that. But
well, I think that's right. I mean, I watched the speech that Shami gave this morning. Shami was originally invited to the history school, and she was talking about the way in which our human rights have been denigrated, if you like, by the virus and by the response of government. And I think she made some really interesting points on the lines that you've made this afternoon. I think the work you're doing is really, really exciting and very important. Someone else has come in and said there's another flag with it looks like a 3 on it. Would that be a marching point as well?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I mean, I think, you know, I mean, I've studied the Chartists, I've studied this period, and I knew that troops came in, and I knew that there were 4,000, 5,000 police who were going to come into London, particularly to defend the river, because Kennington's clearly south of the Westminster Bridge. What I didn't realise was the 2,000 additional special constables, which makes it a huge force the government assembled, isn't it?
Colossal. I mean, part of the idea of the specials was because the 4,000 police came off general duties in London, so the specials were kind of signed up to keep order in the places where the police would have been that day. But they were also a lot of places like the British Museum signed up a lot of its staff members as specials. In other words, you know, they stayed at work, but they had special powers with the idea of. And the British Museum's a really interesting one, because they took stones to the top of the British Museum, so they throw them, and also they had the Royal Engineers in to saw through the joists on the stairs, so that if the Chartists invaded, the stairs would collapse. I mean, you couldn't make it up, some of this stuff.
Yeah, go on.
Sorry.
No, you couldn't. No, I mean, when are you going to go back and look at the Dickens thing? Because I thought that was very interesting, the idea that Dickens may well have been there.
Yes, I'd love to. I'd love to. I mean, there's a lot of these things that you can't always verify. I mean, one is that with William Cuffey being one of the leaders, a lot of history books refer to a report in the Times as saying that that the Chartists were the black man's party. Now, that is really quite a an interesting thing, and you know, a lot of historians that I really respect have printed this. I've been back in the archives. I haven't found it, you know, and you can search all the newspapers. I haven't actually found the original for that, and I'm hoping maybe somebody listening today can point me to that. I will go back and do it. But yeah, Dickens, yeah, it would be nice to see him there, wouldn't it? If we could, yeah. But yeah, I'm sure he's there.
I've got some more questions coming in. I'll try and take some of those. Do you think the Chartists were ahead of their time, given we still don't have annual parliaments? There's a big debate about that, of course, because I don't think there's a way that we're going to ever get annual parliaments. It's too quick, and no one wants to say that they can get anything they want done in a year.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, there's arguments for and against, but the idea of parliaments being accountable while they're sitting, we do have some moves towards that. But yeah, ahead of their time. Yes, I mean, the ideas are powerful, but they're also they weren't the first. You know, there was a bill put to Parliament actually around about the time of the French Revolution, possibly before, asking for electoral reform in this way. And a lot of what was being asked for at Peterloo, in Birmingham, at the big Newhall Hill meetings, and in London, the same thing, electoral reform. So yeah, they were ahead of the time, but they were also a long time coming. So
I've got another question here. It's from Chris Reed. Interesting, he's on Tuesday night. Interesting that the reason for annual parliaments was because of corruption and the buying of votes. How many voters and how many were in a constituency at this time? Do we got any idea? Is there any research on that?
It's really important question. Thank you. Yeah. I need to do that, actually. I mean, it's quite important. Obviously, you've got some tiny constituencies. You've got the obviously the rotten boroughs and all that.
Yeah.
You still
Launceston, where I live, had 4. Launceston, where I live, had 4 MPs.
Yeah, you've still got those, despite the Electoral Reform Act that tried to get rid of. I mean, yes, it gave a few cities, Manchester and Birmingham, suddenly got proper decent representation, but it left it pretty uneven, and it actually disenfranchised some places like Preston, who had it pretty good before that. So it took a long time. 1867, it was opened up a bit, and it took 2 or 3 more attempts until, as we know, 1928, I think, before all men and women over 21 got the vote. So, and it took till 1972 for 18-year-olds to get the vote, and I was lucky because I just got in at that point.
Another question which refers to the talk you gave last year at Tolpuddle. It says, how did the gathering on Kennington Common compare in number to the big demo in support of the Tolpuddle Martyrs? I can't quite remember the numbers that you gave us for that march from Copenhagen Fields last year. Yeah,
well, it's smaller. It's smaller, but you know, if I've got my sums right on both. I mean, the image of the Copenhagen Fields is just fantastic. You know, to see all those people lined up. But what you've got with Copenhagen Fields is this report that people were still leaving King's Cross, where the fields were, at the same time as people were entering Kennington Common, because that march went to Kennington Common as well. So therefore, you could say, a bit like I've done the same thing with the People's Vote, one of the People's Vote marches last year. You can look at the number of people gathered at both ends, and then you add in a multiplication of the width of the road and the length of the road all the way along. So for Copenhagen Fields 1834, I think I came out with about 150,000.
I think you did. It was probably more than I thought it was at the time.
Yeah.
I couldn't remember if it was 125 or 150. Another question: can you see a similar movement starting in America, where there's increasing voter discrepancy? Can we see the Chartists starting in America?
Today.
That's a great question.
Yeah,
it's a great question. We're not here to discuss. We're not here to discuss Trump, but what a great question. Yeah.
Well, absolutely, and a lot of that is about voter registration, isn't it? And corruption, and you know, kind of what do they call that? Forget when you pack a constituency by housing. I can't remember.
Oh, I know what you mean. We've had it here. Yeah, we had it with
that's happening. Yeah, so absolutely, that's a great one. Yeah, thank you.
No, it's great. Well, Dave, we're running out of time quite rapidly. Thank you very much for giving up your time to join us again. I found your talk today absolutely fascinating. I know you and I discussed this last year at Tolpuddle, and I was really looking forward to it. When you told me what you were going to do, I thought that's going to be really interesting, because it's something I have looked into myself, but not in the way that you've done. And you've clearly gone into it in far more detail than I have. I was particularly interested in that. The demands the Chartists were making were freedom from political serfdom, which I thought was lovely, but also a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. I think that was a brilliant thing. So I'm sure you've made us all think, Dave. All the comments I've seen have been brilliant. I'm now seeing, thanks, Dave, great talk. Thanks to everybody. Thank you. Wonderful talk. All that sort of thing coming up in the chat. So clearly everyone's enjoyed it. I've had a great afternoon. I hope everyone who's been here this afternoon with us has enjoyed it. Don't forget, the Radical History School will be live every Tuesday from the 21st of July to the 25th of August, every Tuesday, 7 p.m. We look forward to seeing a lot of you there. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend, Dave. And I'm going to bring this to an end now. Thank you so much again. Thank you very much indeed. Goodbye.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Bye-bye.